Alright, we're going to review what we've gone over in class over the past week. We've gone through several examples of what JavaScript can do and things like that. So I'm going to kind of review all those and just run through them fairly quickly. So the first example that we had was what happens if we want to add an event, not to add an event, but to add a new field to a form every time we click a button. So I'm going to add a form here. And then we'll just add a little HTML. We're going to wrap all the fields that we want in a div. And then just outside of that, we're going to set a button with a type of button and then ID of add, because that's going to be the button that we want to have when we want to click that and have it do something. We'll just call it add there. Alright, so inside each one, we're going to say class equals field, and we create a label for each one. We're just going to call this name1. And then put an input in here. Give it an ID to match the 4. And we'll give it the same name just for simplicity. Alright, so this content right here is what we want to duplicate. Every time we click the add button, we want that to duplicate. So let's look at how we can do that with JavaScript. So the first thing we want to do is reference the container of all those fields that we want to be able to insert. So let's reference that by saying document.get element by ID, and that's going to be fields. And we want to reference the button as well. So let's say add get element by ID of add. And then we want to, on the add, we want to put an event listener. So we said add event listener, and we want it whenever they click on it. So we're going to give it an event of click, and then we're going to have this function, this anonymous function. It's going to run whenever it's called, and we're going to have that whenever it's clicked, we do something right in there. Okay, so we're wanting it to insert a new field with all of this HTML here right after this field inside the div ID fields. So one way we can do that is by coming in and referencing the parent div and saying we want to, inside this inner HTML, we want to take what's there currently and append a string to it. And in that case, we want it to be this particular string. As I mentioned in class, it needs to all be, even though it's going to wrap, you want it to all be one line. Otherwise, JavaScript's not going to understand that it's all one string. Okay, so when it's all in red, you can tell at that point it's correct. Alright, so we want it to, at this point, if we ran it, it's going to add it. But all of them have the same name, the same IDs, and we can't have that without causing errors on our page. So what we need to do is be able to change the name and the ID and the for attribute based on what field it is, or to make each one unique. So let's add a variable called I and give it an initial value of 2, and then we're going to use I++, which increments I by 1 every time the event listener function is called. And so that means that what we can do is come in here and say plus I. And so we're basically sticking the value of I in there. So the first time you click on it, it's going to have a value of 2. Then it's going to increment by 1. So the next time you click on it, it's going to have a value of 3. And so on. I can just change it in these 3 places. And that should work. Now just so we can actually see what it's doing, since we can't see the attributes nearly as conveniently as in the HTML, let's add it to the name as well. Alright, and let's go ahead and add, say, name 1 here. So when we run it, we'll see it comes in, says name 2, name 3, name 4, and on. As many as we add, it's always going to keep incrementing. And so we can see here that I is incrementing up, which means it's also incrementing on our attributes as well. Alright, so I'm going to comment this out, and we'll move on to the next example, which is where we talked about having a slideshow. Alright, so I'm just going to add this in here, and let's give it an ID of slideshow. And then in there, we're just going to add images. So we can say source equals something. And in our case, we're going to use a placeholder image. Placeholder IT. And we'll just call this, we'll give this one a value of 1, and then we'll add in, let me just copy and paste, let's just put 4 images in there, and let's rename each one so that when the slideshow's running we can actually see the difference between each different image. Alright, so when you look over here, we've got image 1, image 2, image 3, and image 4, and so we want these to change one after another, and when it gets to the last one, we want it to go back to the first one. So the first thing we'll do is add some CSS, where starting off, all of these images are hidden. Okay, and so we just set a value of display none, and you can see all of our slides disappeared. Then we can write some JavaScript to display each one at a time. And so let's start off and just grab the container element, which happens to have an ID of slideshow. So we're going to say document.get element by ID of slideshow. Okay. And then we're going to try to reference all the slides inside it. And so we said in class that we can say slides equals slideshow, which means we're getting the slideshow element, and then we want to apply get elements by tag name, and in this case we want image. And so what we're doing is we're saying, by referencing, instead of saying document.get elements by tag name, we're saying that we only want the images that are inside this ID. So if there were other images on the page, our script is only going to be working with the ones inside the div that has an ID of slideshow. Alright, so now with var slides, that means we have an array of all of our images that we can iterate through each time. And so we said that in order to set a timer in JavaScript, we'll use setInterval, and that allows us to pass 2 arguments to it. The second one is probably the easiest one, and that is the time, how often we want this to execute. And in this case, it's counting in milliseconds, so to say 2000 just means that it's going to execute the function every 2 seconds. And the first parameter is the function that we want to use. So we could use an anonymous function and then just run our code inside there. The other thing we could do is actually use a named function, and instead of running this, we could reference a function called Slideshow and then actually set it down here and do something with it. And so that's when it sees this here, it's going to know to automatically look for this particular function. Okay, so there's two different ways you could do it. We're just going to go with the anonymous function here. And execute our code inside it. So we can come in and say slides. Remember that it's a list, so we can actually reference individual ones by using the brackets with a number. And we're going to access some properties on this, and so we're going to look in the style property for a subproperty called display. Okay, and so we're going to set that to block as we want to be visible. So just like we in our CSS we set the property to display none, we're able to in JavaScript change that property as well. Okay, so if we were to do that, let's hit run, and you're going to see after 2 seconds it shows the first image because that's the first element in the array is 0, and so it's set to display block. But we actually want it to change each time and show a different element. So we could come in here and just like we did earlier, we could say I equals 0, and then after we do something we could say I plus plus so that it increments, and then instead of saying I, or instead of saying 0, we just say I. So every time this, when this function executes every 2 seconds, I is going to increase by a value of 1. Okay, so if we run it, wait 2 seconds, shows that, then in 2 seconds it shows another one, and shows the third and the fourth one every 2 seconds. So that at least displays one, but we actually want every time one displays, we want to hide the previous one. So we could do that by saying slides I-1 dot style display equals none. Let's run that, and that actually doesn't work. And the reason that doesn't work, we talked about in class, is because the first time it runs, it's going to say I-1 is going to actually be looking for slide -1, and so we can't have that. So instead of doing that, let's actually use a variable and set that variable to check and see if our value is 0 or not, and do something based on that. So we talked about using the shorthand if-else statements called the ternary operator, and so we're saying whenever that we put our condition in here, which in this case we're going to check and say if I equals 0, and if it does, then it's going to execute whatever is on this side of the colon. So we might say if I is equal to 0, then don't subtract anything, but if it's not, then let's use I minus 1. Alright, so this is what's returned. The value of t is equal to I if it equals 0. If it doesn't, then the value of t is going to be I minus 1. So then we can put that in here, knowing that it's going to work no matter what. Alright, so if we run it, we're going to see it shows image 1, then it hides image 1, shows image 2, hides image 2, shows 3, and then 4. And the problem is, we want it when it gets to the last slide, we want it to start over and loop back around. So we can do that by coming in here and saying if I is greater than or equal to the slides.length, which is getting how many elements are in this slides. Okay, so in this case it's going to have a value of 4, so it's going to say if I is greater than or equal to 4, then let's actually reset the value of I to 0. So it's going to restart basically when it gets to the end. Alright, so let's run that now. I'm going to see, it shows 1, hides 1, shows 2, hides 2, shows 3, hides 3, shows 4, and then starts back over, just like we would expect it to.